The sky above Vraxx 4 boiled with storm fire, churning electric blue clouds that crackled with an energy humanity barely understood. Below, the last remnants of Earth's exodus clung desperately to survival. Fort Resolute, a colony never meant for war, now stood as humanity's final outpost, a scarred relic of their defiance against the Vraxx Dominion. Within its walls, soldiers moved with the hollow efficiency of those who had seen too much death. Engineers whispered frantic prayers over failing machinery. Families, those few who remained, huddled in the underground shelters, clutching memories of a homeworld they would never see again. Humanity had lost the war. The Vraxx, warlords of the void, had deemed them an evolutionary dead end, too reckless, too stubborn, too insignificant to be worthy of the stars. The final transmission from Earth had been a silent scream across the cosmos, abruptly cut off when the Dominion's war fleets darkened the skies. Now, the survivors on Vraxx 4 waited for the inevitable. The ultimatum had been given: surrender and become slaves to the Dominion's insatiable war machine, or be exterminated. Ethan Vale knew what the adults had already decided. The surrender wasn't spoken of openly, not yet, but it loomed in every whispered conversation, in the way General Sorin Vance stared at the colony's dwindling supplies with empty resignation. Ethan had stopped believing in their war long before the others. Not because he lacked courage. He had seen enough of his people fight and die to know courage was not enough, but because he had seen the Draken. Beyond the colony's walls, beyond the ruins of human arrogance, the true rulers of Vraxx 4 reigned. The Draken were legends even to the Vraxx, six-limbed nightmares, serpentine beasts with wings that blotted out the twin suns, eyes that burned with sentience no human had yet deciphered. To the Dominion, they were a natural weapon, a force of destruction to be feared and manipulated. To Ethan, they were something more. He had watched them, even when the others had warned him away. From the ridges overlooking the jungle canopies, he had tracked their movements, studying the way their bodies pulsed with bioluminescent signals, the way their hunts followed patterns that seemed less like instinct and more like strategy. They weren't just beasts. They were thinking, and tonight, as he slipped through the battered western perimeter, past the automated turrets still programmed to shoot anything with wings, Ethan knew something was wrong. The Draken should not be here. Not this close. Not like this. A low, guttural growl rippled through the air, barely distinguishable from the howling winds. Ethan froze. His breath hitched, heart hammering against his ribs. The jungle beyond the perimeter fence was alive, not just with the usual rustling of bioluminescent flora, but with a deeper, more primal presence. Something massive was shifting between the trees, displacing the earth with slow, labored movements. Ethan edged forward, his fingers tightening around the worn grip of his survival knife. The colony's scanners never picked up the Draken, their bodies seemingly absorbing sensor waves like void-born phantoms. But he didn't need scanners. He could feel it. The ground trembled as a shadow broke through the dense foliage, its form catching the twin moon's pale light. A Draken, but not just any Draken. This one was wounded. Its massive body, easily 20 meters from snout to tail, was covered in ragged gashes, thick rivulets of dark violet blood oozing from wounds too deep to be mere battle scars. One of its 6 legs barely touched the ground, its talons curled inward in pain. Ethan's pulse quickened. A Draken should never be weak. And yet this one had been hunted. His mind raced. The Vraxx never engaged Draken directly. They feared them too much, and the humans hadn't launched an offensive in weeks. That left only one explanation. The Draken had turned on one of their own. He should have run. Every instinct, every ounce of human logic screamed at him to retreat. No one survived. Close contact with a wounded apex predator. But then its eyes met his. Twin pools of burning amethyst, swirling with something beyond primal rage, beyond simple animalistic pain. Intelligence, a warning, and something else. Recognition. The Draken knew him. Ethan had spent his entire life observing them from afar, mapping their flight patterns, sketching their bioluminescent pulses in his old, tattered notebook. But never like this, never this close. It should have killed him. It didn't. Instead, it collapsed, its massive body slamming into the ground, shaking the earth with a final, exhausted breath. Ethan hesitated only for a second. Then, against every survival instinct, he stepped closer. The stench of blood and scorched flesh was overwhelming. Up close, the damage was worse than he had realized. Plasma burns, jagged, cauterized wounds that had barely stopped bleeding, the kind of wounds that only another Draken could inflict. It had been exiled. Draken did not tolerate weakness. If one of their own was deemed unfit for the hunt, the matriarch would expel it from the pack, or worse. And this one? This was a royal. Ethan recognized the patterns along its obsidian black scales, Zirkal. He had seen this one before in the distant hunting grounds, flying alongside the matriarch herself. That meant only one thing. This was her offspring. A cold chill swept through him. The matriarch of the Draken was a force beyond reckoning. Even the Vraxx avoided her, steering clear of her dominion unless absolutely necessary. If she had turned against her own blood, then Zirkal was already dead by the laws of its kind. Unless Ethan clenched his jaw, unless someone else gave it a reason to live. His hands trembled as he removed his canteen, the last of his purified water sloshing inside. A stupid idea. He needed that water. But survival had never been about playing it safe. The Draken didn't move as he poured a few drops onto its cracked, bloodied lips. Seconds passed. A growl rumbled deep in its throat, but it didn't snap. It didn't tear him apart. It drank, and that was when Ethan realized the truth. The matriarch had abandoned her own heir, but Zirkal wasn't dead yet, and if Ethan had anything to say about it, he wouldn't die at all. The jungle pulsed with unseen threats, but Ethan barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to the beast before him, the wounded Draken whose survival now inexplicably hinged on him. Zirkal's labored. Breathing echoed in the dark, each exhale a wet rasp of exhaustion and pain. The plasma burns along its flanks still smoldered, faint embers of agony that refused to fade. Ethan had no medical supplies, no training in treating alien physiology, only the stubbornness that had kept him alive when everything else in the universe wanted him dead. He worked by instinct. His hands moved fast, tearing fabric from his already ragged jacket, pressing it against the deepest wound in a desperate attempt to staunch the bleeding. The Draken flinched, but didn't strike him down. That was a good sign, or maybe it was too weak to finish the job. The thought sent a wave of unease through him. A Draken, even injured, should have crushed him with a single twitch of its claws. Instead, Zirkal lay motionless, watching him with those piercing amethyst eyes, its massive chest rising and falling in erratic rhythm. Trust, or something close to it. He wasn't sure how long he stayed there, pressing against wounds that refused to close, whispering assurances to a creature that shouldn't understand them. The night deepened, shadows stretching longer, the sounds of distant predators circling. They would come soon. Scavengers, drawn to the scent of Draken blood. He had to move. Ethan hesitated only a moment before making the craziest decision of his life. Zirkal was too heavy to move alone. Even if Ethan had some kind of hoverloader, which he didn't, the jungle's dense terrain would have ripped it apart in minutes. That left only one option. The Draken had to move under its own power. Ethan took a breath. The idea was insane, borderline suicidal, but if there was one thing he had learned in this war, it was that sometimes the impossible just needed a good push. He stepped forward and placed his hand against Zirkal's snout. Its scales were burning hot, the heat of its body warring against the cold air of the night. The moment his skin touched the beast, a low growl rumbled deep in its throat, the kind that could shatter bones if given strength. But Ethan didn't move. Instead, he did something no human had ever done before. He spoke to it, not in words, not in the guttural roars of the Draken, but in something simpler. His heartbeat. He pressed his palm flat against its snout and let his heart speak, a steady, unbroken rhythm. A pulse, a sign. I am here. I am not prey. Move. Live. Zirkal's eyes flickered, something shifting in their depths. A long moment passed. Then, a shuddering breath. And the Draken moved. It was slow, agonizing, every muscle in its body resisting, but it stood. Its massive form loomed over him, those 6 legs barely holding. The jungle fell silent, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Ethan didn't hesitate. He moved first, stepping away, then turning back, making sure Zirkal could follow. And it did. One step, then another, a human leading a Draken, something that had never been done before. The journey back to the colony's outskirts was an ordeal of sweat, blood, and determination. Ethan guided the beast through the dense jungle, choosing paths wide enough for its massive frame, avoiding sharp inclines where its wounded leg might fail. More than once he thought it would collapse, but every time he pressed his hand to its scales. Feel my heartbeat. Keep moving. And Zirkal listened. By the time they reached the perimeter, dawn was breaking, streaks of crimson and gold cutting through the heavy mist. Fort Resolute loomed ahead, its walls standing like a last remnant of defiance against a universe that had already written humanity off. Ethan could see the sentries on the walls now, their rifles raised, eyes wide with terror. He didn't blame them. From their perspective, he had walked out of the jungle with death itself at his side, and the alarms began to blare. The response was immediate. Sirens howled, spotlights flared to life, painting Zirkal in stark white light, making its wounds look even more monstrous. The heavy turret guns locked on, whirring with barely restrained energy. Ethan threw up his hands as the doors to the outpost burst open. A squad of heavily armed soldiers stormed forward, General Sorin Vance at the front, his expression one of pure disbelief and fury. "Stand down," Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. No one moved. Zirkal let out a deep, throaty growl, but it didn't attack. It could have. It could have torn through them all like paper, but instead it stood beside Ethan, its massive chest heaving with slow, deliberate breaths. A silent message. The soldiers didn't lower their weapons. Vance's voice was low, dangerous. "What the hell have you done?" Ethan didn't blink. He turned back to Zirkal, then to his people. His next words would define everything. "We weren't supposed to win." He met Vance's eyes, unshaken. "But now we have a chance." The silence stretched. Then the first explosion hit. The first explosion shattered the stillness, sending a tremor through the ground. A heartbeat later, the Vraxx Dominion struck. High in the sky, the void-black shapes of their warships tore through. The cloud cover, their engines humming with a deep, malevolent resonance. Orbital bombardment cannons swiveled downward, locking onto Fort Resolute like executioners preparing the final blow. Ethan barely had time to react before the world erupted in fire. A barrage of plasma shells screamed down from the heavens, slamming into the colony's outer defenses, sending shards of reinforced steel and concrete flying like shrapnel. The force of the impact threw him off his feet, the heat searing against his skin. Zirkal recoiled, its massive wings flaring outward, eyes burning with rage. The Vraxx had come to finish the job. Sorin Vance barely hesitated. "All units, battle stations, do not let those bastards through." The colony came alive with war. Turret guns roared, spitting streams of anti-air plasma into the sky. Missiles shrieked, spiraling toward the descending Vraxx dropships, tearing through their armor in bursts of flame. Soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting orders, moving with the desperation of men who knew they were already dead. Ethan knew the truth. They couldn't win. The colony's defenses were crippled, their numbers too few. The Vraxx had them outgunned, outnumbered and outmatched. But they had one thing the Vraxx didn't: a Draken. The first wave of Vraxx soldiers stormed through the breach, their exoskeletal armor gleaming black under the rising sun, their weapons humming with lethal energy. They expected humans, scrambling and desperate. They didn't expect Zirkal. The Draken moved like a living storm, its injured body forgotten in the fury of battle. A single beat of its wings sent a shockwave through the battlefield, sending soldiers flying like broken dolls. And then, fire. A blinding column of violet flame erupted from its maw, sweeping through the ranks of the Vraxx, turning the ground into molten slag. Their armor, built to withstand human weapons, melted like wax in an inferno. For the first time in history, the Vraxx felt fear. Ethan moved with the Draken, staying close, guiding it toward the enemy's command forces. If they could take out the field commanders, the Vraxx ground troops would be thrown into chaos. But then, the Matriarch arrived. A deafening screech split the air, so piercing it sent a shockwave through the battlefield. The sky darkened as something vast and terrible descended, the Matriarch of the Draken. Her wings stretched so wide they blotted out the sun, her scales a crown of obsidian and gold, her eyes twin orbs of liquid fire. And she was angry. Ethan barely had time to react before she struck. A single swipe of her tail shattered the ground, sending Zirkal sprawling, its body crashing into the remains of a fallen watchtower. The impact shook the earth. The Vraxx didn't hesitate. They saw their chance. Warriors surged forward, weapons trained, preparing to execute the weakened heir of their greatest enemy. Ethan did the only thing he could. He ran toward Zirkal. Pain. His body screamed in protest, but he forced himself forward, his hands moving before his mind could catch up. He placed them against Zirkal's bloodied scales. The Draken wasn't moving. No, 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 no! He clenched his fists, slamming them against the beast's massive frame. Get up! His voice was raw, desperate. Nothing. Ethan closed his eyes, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He pressed his forehead against Zirkal's snout. A pulse, a rhythm, a connection, and something shifted, a spark of understanding. Zirkal's eyes snapped open. A roar erupted from its throat, not just of pain, but of fury. It moved faster than Ethan thought possible, a blur of wings and claws and fire. Zirkal launched itself toward the Matriarch. The battle of the Draken had begun. The Matriarch and Zirkal clashed in midair, their bodies locking together like titans from an ancient war. They rolled and tore into each other, their flames twisting into dueling infernos, their roars shaking the battlefield. But it wasn't a battle of dominance, it was a challenge, and Ethan finally understood. This wasn't about power, it was about recognition. The Matriarch had cast Zirkal out, branded him unworthy, but now he fought not as a son, but as an equal, and she yielded. The moment was silent, and then the Draken bowed. Ethan stared in disbelief as the Matriarch, the most powerful creature on this world, lowered her head to her once banished heir. The battle was over. The Draken had chosen a leader, and they had chosen Zirkal. The Vraxx saw it happen, and in that moment, they knew they had lost. The Draken turned against them, not as wild beasts, but as an allied force. The skies became fire. The Vraxx broke, and humanity stood victorious. The battlefield lay in ruins. The once mighty Vraxx Dominion, warlords of the void, had been shattered beneath the combined fury of Draken and human. Their warships, once looming gods of destruction, now lay as burning wreckage, their shattered husks littering the ground. Ethan Vale stood in the center of it all, his body aching, burned, bruised, but still standing, still alive. Above him, the Draken roared, not in rage, but in victory. The Matriarch had accepted Zirkal's challenge, and with it, something changed in the hierarchy of this brutal world. The Draken had remained neutral in the war before, but now they were more than bystanders. They were allies, and the Vraxx had no idea how to fight both humans and apex predators. Their forces had retreated, what few ships remained burning their engines in an attempt to escape before they were hunted down. For the first time in years, humanity had won a battle they were never meant to survive, and it was because of him. Fort Resolute was silent when they returned, not out of fear, not out of despair, but out of pure, unfiltered awe. Every eye in the colony was locked onto the impossible sight of Ethan Vale leading Zirkal through the shattered outer gates, his hand resting against the Draken's scorched, battle-worn scales. Even General Sorin Vance, a man whose resolve had never broken, looked stunned beyond words. The soldiers who had spent their entire lives fearing the Draken now watched as one moved in step with a human, not as a pet, not as a slave, but as a partner. For a moment there was nothing. Then someone dropped their rifle. The sound snapped through the air like thunder, and suddenly, cheering. It started as a murmur, a disbelieving whisper that this wasn't a trick, wasn't a dream. Then it spread, faster, louder, unstoppable. The last of humanity, the remnants of a species that was meant to be wiped from history, were cheering because they had done the impossible. They had tamed the storm, they had fought alongside dragons, and they had won. Later, when the fires had been put out and the wounded were being treated, Ethan stood alone at the edge of the colony, staring into the distance where the Draken hunting grounds stretched endlessly beyond the horizon. Zirkal stood beside him, its massive form silhouetted against the stars. It had a choice now. It could leave, return to its kind, take its place as heir to the Matriarch, ruling the skies of Vraxx 4. Ethan had a choice too. He could stay. He could live among the humans, among his people, hailed as the hero who turned the tide of extinction. But something inside him knew the truth. Zirkal turned its head, those amethyst eyes studying him, waiting. Ethan exhaled, a decision made. He climbed onto its back, gripping the ridge of its scaled spine, feeling the familiar warmth of its body beneath him. The Matriarch watched from afar, silent and regal, before spreading her colossal wings and taking to the skies. Zirkal followed. For the first time, Ethan didn't watch the Draken from the ground. He rode among them, not as an enemy, not as prey, but as one of them. And as they disappeared into the endless sky, Fort Resolute's people looked up, knowing that for the first time since the war began, humanity had a future worth fighting for. The stars stretched endlessly above, an infinite sea of possibilities. The cold void of space had once been humanity's graveyard, a vast, uncaring expanse where their dreams of expansion had been burned away by the Vraxx. Now it was his hunting ground. Ethan Vale soared through the clouds, wind roaring past his face, the heat of Zirkal's body beneath him, a constant reminder that this wasn't a dream. He had left the colony behind, left behind the remains of humanity's last war, because he knew something they didn't. The Vraxx weren't the true threat. They were just the first wave. The warning had come in the final hours of the battle, whispered from the dying lips of a Vraxx commander as Ethan stood over him, watching his broken body collapse in the dirt. "You think you've won, human?" The Vraxx had rasped, blood pooling between his mandibles. "You have no idea what's coming." The words had buried themselves in Ethan's mind, refusing to let go. And then, the look in Zirkal's eyes when he had spoken them. Draken didn't fear the Vraxx, but something in those words had made Zirkal recoil, something older, something worse. High above Vraxx 4, the matriarch flew beside them, her vast wings stirring the sky like a storm given flesh. Below, the other. Draken followed, a force of nature untethered from their ancient neutrality. They had taken Ethan as one of their own. They had chosen to fight, but against what? The question burned in Ethan's chest as Zirkal let out a deep, resonant growl, wings tilting as they broke through the planet's stratosphere. And then they saw it. A ship floating in the darkness, not human, not Vraxx. Something else. Ethan's pulse thundered. The ship was old, older than anything he had ever seen. Its surface was etched with glyphs, its design impossible, like it had been built by something that didn't understand physics as humans knew it. It was watching them, waiting. Zirkal tensed beneath him, muscles coiling like a predator, sensing an unseen rival. Ethan tightened his grip on the reins. The war with the Vraxx had been only the beginning. Something worse was out there. And now? Now they knew humanity wasn't supposed to win. But they had, and whoever was watching wouldn't let that go unanswered. Ethan exhaled, eyes narrowing as he urged Zirkal forward. Let's find out what comes next.